Hey everyone, in this video what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to some notions that are explicitly in ethics. We'll talk about metaethics. There's also practical ethics, applied ethics, normative ethics, situation ethics. There's a lot of different terms that we can apply to different sub-disciplines, but the main one we're going to do here is primarily theories of descriptive ethics, where various thinkers are telling us, here's how we can figure out what's right and wrong. Sometimes it's principles, methods, ways of seeing the world. So first of all, what is ethics? As simply as I can put it, ethics is the study of right and wrong, good and bad. What we should do versus what we should not do. What we must do, what we must not do. What we ought to do versus what we ought not to do. And other kinds of iterations like that. The study of ethics can be divided into a couple of different parts. We can talk about descriptive ethics, which is a lot of what we'll be doing in this class, looking at what do people say ethics is. And then there's practical ethics, which is here's what you actually should do. And then there's another subdivision called metaethics, which is before we can even talk about really what's right and wrong, how do we even answer that question? What are moral claims? Are they anything at all? And so I'm going to start by talking about metaethics first, then I'll get into a little bit about ethical theories. So let me start by talking about metaethics first. Metaethics, again, is before you can even get to a claim like murder is wrong, which would be a moral or ethical claim. How do we even know that murder is wrong? How do we get to something like that? When I say the phrase, murder is wrong, what am I doing? What are we doing when we say things like that? Metaethics tries to answer this question. And there are a couple different metaethical theories. Here I'm going to talk about them briefly. Basically, you have a couple different ways that metaethics can be divided. First, you've got cognitivism. In cognitivist metaethics, you say that moral claims are truth apt, or they have truth value. So if you remember when I was talking about logic and the different kinds of logic, I talked about truth value, that there's different kinds of claims. But for some kinds of things that we can say in English or in another language, have truth value. So if I say something like, today is Tuesday, and I look at the calendar and it's actually Tuesday, that statement is true. If I say today's Tuesday, but look at the calendar and it's any other day of the week, that statement is false. So the statement today is Tuesday has truth value, or it's truth apt. But if I say other kinds of utterances, or I write these things down, they don't have to merely be spoken. If I say something like, is today Tuesday? That's a question. It's not truth apt, it has no truth value. Now, did I say, is today Tuesday? That has a truth value. But questions don't have truth value. Propositions don't have truth value. So if I say, let's go see a movie on Tuesday, no truth value. Again, I said, let's go see a movie on Tuesday, has truth value, but just saying, let's go see a movie on Tuesday, has no truth value. Those kinds of proposals. Imperatives. If I say, you will take your exam on Tuesday, true or false? Neither, because it doesn't have truth value. So cognitivists say that when we say moral claims, like murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, things like that, those are actually statements that can be true or false. On the other hand, there's, in metaethics, what's called non-cognitivism. Non-cognitivists say, basically, okay, when we say phrases like murder is wrong, they're not true or false statements. They're certainly expressing something, but they're not expressing something that can be talked about in terms of truth and falsity. They're not absurd, because questions aren't absurd, proposals aren't absurd, imperatives aren't absurd, but they don't have truth value. So non-cognitivists say ethical claims are doing something, moral claims are doing something, but you can't really talk about it in terms of truth and falsity. It's like an expression. And there's different kinds of non-cognitivism that I don't really want to get into too much detail. A couple of examples would be like emotivism. Emotivism would say that when you say something like murder is bad, you're really saying something along the lines of, I don't like murder. Then there's, say, norm expressivism, which says, really, when you say something like murder is bad, well, the culture that I live in thinks murder is bad, so that's why I say things like that, because I want to get along with everybody. I don't want to rock the boat too much. Now, that view is different from cultural relativism that we'll talk about in another video. Then metaethics can also be divided into realism versus anti-realism. Realists would say morality refers to something that's true or real in the external world around us. It's not something just in our heads. It's true out there too, in what sometimes people call objective reality. And through some kind of means, we can figure out what's true out there. Whether it's really distant, it's hard for us to figure it out maybe, but we can figure it out if we just apply the appropriate means. Maybe it's looking at certain kinds of texts, seeing what the divine has commanded. Maybe it's something that we could figure out hypothetically, scientifically. If we look at it, it's something real in the world. Maybe we use our reason, maybe we use our sense experience, but it's something real out there. On the other hand, anti-realists say that moral laws are not discoverable. Moral laws, like something like murder is wrong. You're not able to discover like scientific laws of motion. Murder is wrong is not the same thing as saying an object at rest will always remain at rest unless acted upon by an external force. It's not scientific in the same way. It's not discoverable and testable in the same kind of way. Anti-realists say that morality doesn't really refer to anything in the external world. But just because someone's an anti-realist, it doesn't refer to anything real in the external world, does not mean that an anti-realist would necessarily be opposed to making moral judgments. Another distinction we can talk about in metaethics is the distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism. Naturalism is the view that moral claims and ethical values are properties which can be studied in nature, and our moral values are reducible or can be broken down into that. So something like, we see that in nature animals reproduce, therefore reproduction is good, therefore things that are conducive to reproduction are good, therefore institutions like marriage are good and valuable for that reason because they're conducive to something we already see happening in nature. Whereas non-naturalists would say moral concepts are analyzable, but they're intuitions. That is, there's something that we know, but they're not just reducible to nature. There's something else going on there. Now, this course is not going to be too much into metaethics. We're going to talk about ethical theories, but I want you to think about that there's a lot of what we call first order issues in ethics, where we're talking about what's right, what's wrong, what's the right thing to do here. But sometimes we have to think about the second order questions, which is before we even get to what's right or wrong here, how do we even figure out what right and wrong is in the first place? And a lot of this course is going to be talking about the different viewpoints there are on talking about how we determine it. So when we're talking about ethical theories, the ethical theories are saying, here are the means whereby we can figure out what's right and what's wrong. So that's most of what we're going to be doing this semester, is looking at different theories. And when I say moral theories, I mean here's different views or perspectives. When I call them theories, it's a cohesive perspective that says there's a whole system by which we can figure out here's what we should do. Here's an apparatus, here's a system of tools that we can use to figure out what we ought to do. But sometimes they have different metaethical assumptions that I've already discussed here. Now that I've talked about metaethics generally, let's go back around to talking about ethics more broadly. What is ethics then? So I've talked about metaethics, and again, that's how we figure out, like, before we even get to talking about right and wrong and good and bad and all that stuff, there are the terms where we can divide how we even think about talking about it before we even get to the actual content of what's right and what's wrong. Sure, that's very technical and very challenging, but a worthwhile pursuit. Let's talk about ethics. So, moving back a bit, what is ethics? The English word ethics, we follow its etymological trajectory, comes from an old Greek word, ethika, which means ethics. So our English word ethics comes from an Attic Greek word, ethike, which itself comes from two other Greek words that are important. You've got ethos, that means character, who you are, related to the word ethos, which means habit or custom, manner, like what you do. And so think about that, just even the word ethics. It's kind of a combination of who you are as a person, character, and then what you do, what your actions are. The word ethics just has to do with character, habit. But what about this other term, morality, that pops up a lot? What's the difference then between ethics and morality? Well, here's something that's not helpful. Those terms that I used, ethos, ethike, those are all Greek terms. The Latin word for custom or habit is moris, where we get morality and mores and moral and all that stuff. So it's really just the Latin word for the same stuff. So this is just laid the groundwork for some terms in here, some terms I want you to be familiar with. So when I say metaethics, I'm not just making up some word. When I say metaethics, what I mean is before we even get to talking about ethics, how do we figure out what's right and wrong? So ethics is, again, that's bad, that's good. Metaethics is how do we know that before we even get there? That's a good question to ask, because sometimes ethics, as we'll see in the next thing that I'm going to talk about, because in the next video I'm going to talk about ancient ethics. And something that we see in ancient ethics is that ancient thinkers were often getting at this problem of, that I don't like what this person is doing. That feels wrong to me. But is it just a feeling? Like, you know this. You've had experiences before where you've seen somebody do something, you heard about something, and it disgusts you. And you're like, oh, that fills me with revulsion. I don't like that. Well, and our moral feelings, when we're like, that's wrong, is it really just a feeling of disgust? Or is there something more to it than that? When you really like something, you're saying, that's good. Is it really just that you like it, or is there something deeper going on there? That's the question of metaethics. So I say all this, and I did all this stuff with the logic stuff, so that when we're getting into talking about the ethical theories themselves, which I'm going to break down for you here in a moment, we have the wherewithal to be able to say, what's going on here, what this person is doing, it seems like they're talking about just feeling. They're saying it's not just feeling. Are they being logical here? Is there some kind of fallacy going on here? That's the reason why we spend all that time on that stuff. Let's now break down, when we get to the ethical theories, what kinds of ethical theories are there? The rest of the semester is, for the most part, going to be going into more detail about these. So ethical theories are the actual theories that say, here's what right and wrong is, not just how do we get there. Each one of them makes some assumptions, and we'll see if we can figure out what they are as we go through things, as we go through the content. There are basically what can be called relativistic theories and universalistic theories. Sometimes just relativism and universalism. Relativistic theories would include moral subjectivism, cultural relativism, and divine command theory. And basically, what relativistic theories say is that it comes down to what somebody has said or proclaimed. Universalistic theories, on the other hand, do not reduce down to what somebody has simply said or uttered. Universalistic theories make the claim that certainly moral claims can be true or false, but they're not merely relative to what somebody or someone has said, written down, or felt, but that they're just true for everyone. For the most part, I think we can say in all times and all places. So a relativistic theory might say, this is true for this person, this is true for this society, this is true for this group of people that God has spoken to. Universalists would say, nope, what's right or what's wrong is true in all times and all places. When it comes to morality, there might be particular kinds of differences in history in terms of attitudes about various innocuous subjects, but when it comes to morality, that never changes. Murder is always wrong, or something like that, because it's wrong for everybody to commit murder. Whereas a relativist might say something like, it's wrong for me to commit murder because I think it's wrong. Or it's wrong for me to commit murder because my society says so. It's wrong for me to commit murder because God said so. What it boils down to is it's right or wrong, whatever it is, because somebody says so in relativism. In universalism, it's right or wrong because it just simply is. And we all know it in some kind of way. There's some way that we can deduce that. Universalistic theories would include things like virtue ethics, rights ethics, natural law, utilitarianism, and deontology. And then later in the semester, I'll also talk about another series of what I'll call other approaches, especially existentialism, where we're kind of looking at it from a completely different perspective altogether. So when I talk about these different moral theories, it's not that you have to do one of these. In fact, many people throughout history that we'll see, even in people that we're covering that are often associated with particular theories, kind of pick and choose in some ways from some different traditions. And different traditions are coming together. So what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to kind of get us into a discussion of ethics by talking about ancient ethics. And ancient ethics will help us segue into talking about relativistic ethics. So when I say I'm going to talk about ancient ethics, what I'm going to do next time, I'm going to start going through Plato's Euthyphro, and then from there we'll go into some of Aristotle's moral philosophy, and also Kongzi in China, his sort of ancient ethical philosophy there, which has a lot of similarity to what's going on in Aristotle. It's not identical. In fact, Kongzi predates Aristotle by several centuries. And then we'll get into particular relativistic kinds of ethics. That concludes sort of an introductory stuff about the terms in ethics that we're going to be using. And so next time I'll be getting into ancient ethics, starting with Plato's Euthyphro that we'll go through together.